Hello, greetings. This is Professor Jun Cajigal and welcome to this online lecture on the respiratory system. Now, before we go into the details of the respiratory system, please like and share this video so that we could reach more students taking life sciences. Please like and share my Facebook page, the Science Guy TV Kaspacers channel, and please subscribe also to my YouTube channel, the Science Guy Professor Jun Cajigal. Alright, so let us now study the respiratory system. Hello, greetings and good day. So for this online lecture, we will be focusing on the anatomy and the physiology of the respiratory system. Now, before we go into the details of the respiratory system, I guess it is proper for us to enumerate the functions of the respiratory system. Now, the respiratory system is an air distributor, meaning it has the important function of taking in oxygen into the atmosphere and distributes it to our body cells and tissues via the cardiovascular system. Also, our respiratory system is a gas exchanger, meaning that carbon dioxide is released and again the blood takes in oxygen via the respiratory system. And the respiratory system filters, warms, and humidifies the air, as I will explain later. Also, the respiratory system influences speech and it allows for sense of smell. Now, our respiratory system is composed of two major divisions. The first is the upper respiratory tract. And the upper respiratory tract is composed of the following. We have the nose, we have the nasal cavity, the sinuses, the pharynx, and the larynx. So that's the upper respiratory tract. Again, we have the nose, the nasal cavity, the sinuses, the pharynx, and the larynx. And we have the lower respiratory tract composed of the following. We have the trachea, the bronchial tree, which is composed of the bronchi and the bronchioles inside the lungs. So at this point, let us now trace the passage of air along the respiratory tract. Now, the air enters the body through the nose and eventually reaches the nasal cavity. Now, the air is warmed, moistened, and filtered as it passes through the nasal cavity. Now, the air must be warmed and moistened in order to facilitate the diffusion of gases in the alveoli, as I will explain later. And the air must be filtered out of unwanted dust particles and other foreign materials that may enter the respiratory tract. Now let us go into the details of the anatomy of the nose and the nasal cavity. So again, in the nose and in the nasal cavity, air is warmed, moistened, and filtered. And in terms of its anatomy, the nose is composed of the following. First, we have the palatine bone. The palatine bone separates the nasal cavity from the mouth. And there are cases wherein the palatine bone does not form correctly. And if that's the case, there is a condition known as a cleft palate. Now, the palatine bones in this condition does not form correctly, so the patient has difficulty in swallowing and speaking. Then we have the septum. The septum separates the right and left nostrils, and the septum together with the entire nasal cavity is rich in blood vessels or capillaries. And lastly, we have the sinuses. The sinuses are four air-containing spaces in the skull that opens or drains into the nose. Alright, so that's the anatomy and the physiology of the nose and the nasal cavity. Then eventually the air passes the pharynx, which has the epiglottis that prevents food from entering the trachea. So the pharynx is also known as the throat, and the pharynx contains the epiglottis, which is a flap of tissue that opens and closes in order to prevent food from entering the respiratory tract. So that's the pharynx or the throat. And the pharynx is located at the base of the skull to the esophagus, and the pharynx has three divisions. So namely the nasopharynx, that is behind the nose to the soft palate, and there are adenoids that swell and block. And we have the oropharynx behind the mouth, soft palate to the hyoid bone, and in the oropharynx you have the tonsils, and we have the laryngopharynx, hyoid bone into the esophagus. Now, in order to help you visualize the location of the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx, let's take a look at this diagram. So we have here color-coded locations. So the green represents the nasopharynx just behind the nasal cavity. The yellow is the oropharynx just behind the mouth. And we have the blue, which is the hypopharynx or the laryngopharynx, which is near the larynx and the esophagus. So those are the locations of the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the hypopharynx or laryngopharynx. So right after passing through the pharynx, the air now enters the larynx. The upper part of the trachea contains the larynx. The larynx contains the vocal cords, which are two bands of tissue that extends across the opening of the larynx. The larynx is also known as our voice box, and it is located at the root of our tongue to the upper end of the trachea. The larynx is made up mostly of cartilage, and there are two pairs of folds of cartilaginous tissue. So we have the vestibular, which are the false vocal cords, and we have the true vocal cords. So at this point, let us now zoom in on the structure of the vocal cords, also known as the glottis. The vocal cords, they play an important role in the production of sound and speech. So every time we engage ourselves in phonation or we converse, the vocal cords appear slit-like. While as we undergo respiration, we take in air and exhale carbon dioxide, the vocal cords or glottis appear wide and triangular. And here is an actual video of our vocal cords, and as I have mentioned a while ago, there are two folds. The white structure, those are the vocal folds, and the red area, that's the vestibular fold. And you will notice that the appearance of the vocal cords here is slit-like, so the person here is engaged in phonation. And you will notice the vibration of the vocal folds or the true vocal cords. So that's how sound and speech is produced. So isn't that fascinating indeed? And here is a photo of the vocal cords that appear wide and triangular. So the person here is taking in air or exhaling air, carbon dioxide. And that white flap of tissue, that's the epiglottis. The epiglottis sees to it that the food goes to the esophagus and not to the trachea. So isn't that fascinating indeed? Now once the air had passed through the larynx and the vocal cords, the air now moves into the trachea or the windpipe. So after passing through the larynx and the vocal cords, the air now moves into the trachea or the windpipe. Now the trachea or the windpipe is the tubular structure between the larynx and the bronchi or the bronchial tubes. And the trachea is composed of smooth cartilage, and C-shaped rings of cartilage. Now the cartilage tissue here sees to it that the trachea doesn't collapse. And in case the trachea is blocked by an object and the person cannot breathe, there is a surgical procedure known as tracheostomy. This is the cutting of an opening in the trachea to allow the person to breathe in case of blockage. So that's the trachea. And again, the trachea is that long tube that connects your larynx or voice box to your bronchi. Your bronchi then sends air to your lungs. Your trachea is a key point of your respiratory system. And if you will notice in our illustration, the trachea is made of rings of cartilage. Near the larynx, you have the thyroid and the cricoid cartilage. And along the tube, you have those tracheal cartilage. The cartilage sees to it that the trachea won't collapse. And here is an actual endoscope photo of the inside of the trachea. And you will notice that inside the trachea, you have a layer of mucus. Now, this mucus layer keeps allergens, dust particles, or other debris out of your lungs. And also in that mucus layer, you have small hair-like structures known as cilia. The cilia, they move in rhythmic fashion to push mucus out of your trachea so that you either expel it or you swallow it. Now, at the base of the trachea divides into two tubes called the bronchi that carries the air into the lungs. The bronchi, these are the tubes that branch off from the trachea and enters into the lungs. And just like the trachea, the bronchi, they are also ciliated. And once inside the lungs, the bronchi further divides into the primary bronchi, then into the secondary bronchi, then tertiary bronchi inside the lungs. And eventually, the tertiary bronchi branches off into bronchioles, leading into the alveoli. So here is an endoscope photo of the trachea branching off into two tubes called the bronchi. Alright, so again, those are the two tubes at the base of the trachea. So those are the bronchi. Then inside the lungs, the bronchi further branches off into the primary bronchi, the secondary bronchi, tertiary bronchi, then bronchioles leading into the alveoli or the air sacs. So those are the bronchi. So from the trachea divides into two tubes called bronchi leading to the lungs. And inside the lungs, the bronchi divides into smaller and smaller tubes. So from the primary bronchi into secondary bronchi and tertiary bronchi getting smaller and smaller, then into the bronchioles leading into the alveoli or the air sacs. So the bronchi branch into smaller and smaller tubes leading to the bronchioles. The bronchioles terminate in grape-like sac clusters called alveoli. Then the alveoli are surrounded by a network of tiny blood vessels or capillaries. So those are the alveoli. The alveoli is surrounded by microscopic blood vessels called capillaries. Now the question is, what happens inside the alveoli? Now the alveoli allows the exchange of gases. So carbon dioxide from the blood is expelled while oxygen from the environment is taken in by the blood. So the blood now becomes oxygenated and goes to the pulmonary vein back to the heart. So the alveoli allows this exchange of gases between the external environment and the blood. Alright, so isn't that fascinating that the alveoli allows this exchange of gases between the environment and the blood. So carbon dioxide from the blood is expelled and the blood absorbs oxygen. Eventually, that oxygen-rich blood goes to the pulmonary vein back to the heart. Now, before we study the mechanism of breathing, let's watch this video about the respiratory system and what happens inside the alveoli. Alright, let's watch this.
So, how exactly does the respiratory system work? Let's take a closer look now. As we said, the major function of the respiratory system is to supply every nook and cranny of the body with oxygen, and it also serves to collect carbon dioxide, a byproduct of cellular respiration, and expunge it from the body when we exhale. We already learned about part of this process when we talked about the circulatory system. There, we learned about how oxygen can bind to hemoglobin and travel through the bloodstream, diffusing into tissue at capillary beds. But we also have to learn about how oxygen gets into the bloodstream in the first place. And for that, we need to understand pulmonary ventilation, also called breathing, whereby oxygen enters the lungs from our surroundings, as well as external respiration, which is how oxygen gets from the lungs to the blood, and how carbon dioxide gets from the blood to the lungs. To understand this, let's take a look at this system as a whole. The respiratory system includes the nose, nasal cavity, paranasal sinuses, larynx, trachea, bronchi, and lungs, which contain little sacs called alveoli. All of these components belong to one of two zones. There is the respiratory zone, which is where gas is exchanged within the lungs, and the conducting zone, which is all the rest, where air comes in and out of the body. Starting with the nose, we probably know that air enters through the nostrils, and since we've already touched on other structural aspects of the nose earlier in the series, we will jump straight to the nasal cavity. This is separated from the oral cavity by the palate, which has two sections, the bony hard palate and the muscular soft palate. We can also see the nasal vestibule with hairs for filtering, as well as three nasal conchi, which are mucosa-covered projections, separated by nasal meatuses. These serve to filter, heat, and moisten the air. The nasal cavity is surrounded by the paranasal sinuses, which produce mucus that flows into the nasal cavity. Next, we see the pharynx, or throat. This connects the nasal cavity with the mouth. This has three regions, the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx. This passageway continues down into the esophagus when eating food, but as far as air goes, the next stop is the larynx, or voice box. This provides an airway and also serves as the site of voice production. The larynx is comprised of a variety of cartilages, including the epiglottis, which stays open for airflow, but when swallowing, it will cover up the laryngeal inlet so that we don't end up breathing our food. Then we see the vocal folds and vestibular folds, which are the true vocal cords and false vocal cords, respectively. More on these structures another time. Next, we find the trachea, or windpipe, which descends and divides into two main or primary bronchi, one to the right and one to the left. Each bronchus will quickly subdivide into lobar or secondary bronchi, which in turn branch into segmental or tertiary bronchi, and this continues even further until we get to passageways less than 1 millimeter in diameter, which are called bronchioles. As these tubes get smaller, the epithelium gets thinner, the amount of cartilage decreases, and the amount of smooth muscle increases. This ends at the terminal bronchioles, which feed into the respiratory bronchioles, and this marks the boundary between the conducting zone and the respiratory zone. The respiratory bronchioles have structures that protrude called alveoli, which are collected in alveolar sacs, like grapes in a bunch. Because of the extensive branching in the bronchi, this results in hundreds of millions of alveoli, and this is where gas exchange takes place. These structures have very thin walls made of a single layer of squamous epithelial cells, which is what allows for the diffusion of gases, and they are covered by a cobweb of pulmonary capillaries. So blood vessels are right up against the alveoli, ready to make a trade. The air in the sacs has plenty of oxygen and the blood doesn't, so diffusion occurs spontaneously. And the blood has a good amount of carbon dioxide, and that will diffuse in the opposite direction so that it can be exhaled. Now let's discuss the lungs, which house all of this internal structure. These cone-shaped organs occupy almost all of the thoracic cavity, and they are surrounded by the visceral pleura and parietal pleura, while lying in close contact with the ribs from the apex down to the base. The hilum is where blood vessels and nerves enter and leave the lungs, and the cardiac notch is a small cavity in the left lung that accommodates the heart. We can see different fissures in each lung that divide them into different lobes, with 2 fissures and 3 lobes in the right lung, and 1 fissure and 2 lobes for the left. Lung tissue itself is called stroma, which is made of elastic connective tissue. When we looked at the circulatory system, we mentioned the pulmonary arteries and veins that bring blood to and from the lungs, arriving oxygen poor and leaving oxygen rich. So we can imagine those connecting to the pulmonary capillaries to complete the circuit. Within the lungs, there is the intrapulmonary pressure, or the pressure in the alveoli, and the intrapleural pressure, the pressure in the pleural cavity that sits between the 2 pleurae. The intrapleural pressure is negative, which is what keeps the lungs open. Ventilation, or breathing, is the result of the activity of inspiratory muscles, namely the diaphragm and intercostal muscles, which produces a change in volume and thereby a change in pressure, allowing air to enter along the pressure gradient. As they relax, expiration occurs. In between, oxygen diffuses and binds to hemoglobin present in the blood so that it can then be transported to tissues all around the body. And with that, we have a basic understanding of the respiratory system. And combining this with previous knowledge of the circulatory system, we have a clear picture of how oxygen enters the body and gets to where it needs to go.
Alright, so I hope you have learned a lot about the respiratory system through that video. Now, before we end with this lecture on the respiratory system, let's study the so-called mechanism of breathing. Now, breathing occurs when the movement of gases is through a pressure gradient, meaning that gases move through a region of high pressure to a region of low pressure. Now, when the atmospheric pressure, which is 760 millimeters of mercury, is greater than the lung pressure itself, the air flows inward. So we call that inspiration of air. Now, on the other hand, when the atmospheric pressure is less outside and the lung pressure is greater than the atmospheric pressure, which is 760 millimeters of mercury, the air flows outward, and we call that expiration of air. And the diaphragm plays an important role in this change in the pressure gradient. Now, when the diaphragm contracts downward, the air pressure inside the lungs becomes less and the atmospheric pressure outside is greater. So the air moves in. And when the diaphragm relaxes upwards, the air pressure inside the lungs becomes greater as compared to the atmospheric pressure outside, so the air moves outward. Now, to further help you visualize this explanation on the mechanism of breathing, let's watch this video. Alright, so let's watch this.
What is the mechanism that allows breathing, and is it an active or passive process? First, we have to understand pressure. Outside the body, the air is 760 millimeters of mercury. At rest, the intrapulmonary pressure is also 760 millimeters of mercury. An important concept to remember when we talk about breathing is how gases always want to take the path of least resistance, moving from areas of high pressure into areas of low pressure. Breathing consists of two distinct phases: inspiration, inhalation, and expiration, exhalation. During inspiration, the intercostal muscles will contract and move outward. The diaphragm will contract and move downward. Notice how this increases the volume in the thoracic cavity and subsequently lowers the pressure inside. As a result of the larger volume, the intrapulmonary pressure has dropped within the lungs to 759 millimeters of mercury, causing air to be drawn in from the outside. Due to the contraction of the muscles, we call inspiration an active process. During expiration, the intercostal muscles and the diaphragm relax, causing a decrease in intrapulmonary volume. As the volume decreases, there's an increase in intrapulmonary pressure to 761 millimeters of mercury. We understand that air moves from a higher pressure to a lower pressure, and as a result, air is moved from the lungs out to the atmosphere. Due to the elastic recoil of the muscles relaxing, expiration is considered a passive process.
Alright, so I guess that's about it for our online lecture on the respiratory system. So I hope you have learned a lot about the workings of the lungs and the organs involved in the respiratory system. So thank you for your attention. Thank you for your time. This is your Spacer and Space Commander, Professor Jun Cajigal, saying live long and prosper. Alright, so I'll see you mga ka-spacers in our next video. Alright, so long for now.